What is up, everybody? Super Tuesday. Welcome live. Super excited to have you guys in the studio. It is a frantic countdown to the web sale. I think we're all aware of it by now, but if you're not, Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Is that Pacific Standard or Pacific Daylight? Which one are we in?
Daylight.
Pacific Daylight Time, 9 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. We're going to be putting a lot of trees on our web store, and you guys can have at it. Really, really good trees this time. Again, we've talked about it. I think it's our best web sale yet. I think everybody will be excited with what's going to be there. We're busting our butts to finally get it done and to make sure that all those trees look really handsome for you guys. Anyways, got Sam on the mic this evening.
Hello.
Got Josh producing the stream. Even Jesus on the detail cams. We are also saying a very bittersweet farewell to our intern who's been here for the past 3 months. It's Sam's last night in the house.
Bye.
Yeah, it's been a really good 3 months. We've gotten some incredible work done. Sam's advanced his bonsai skills, and now we release him to the world to fly on his own. Anyways, let's dig into the work tonight. Now, this is a scope of work that isn't necessarily something often talked about. We have a Pinus sylvestris Scots pine that had its initial structure set and initial styling done, and we set that structure. We also lay out our secondaries. We try to make the tree look as good as it possibly can every time we put our hands on the tree. And typically by this time in the fall, a lot of our other work, say juniper work, big stylings, all of those things are kind of coming to a close because we are getting inside of that window where cold weather is right around the corner. We are going to be in freezing temperatures for multiple nights this coming week. And once we start seeing the 30 degrees, 28 degrees, 25 degrees, those temperatures start to tell us that the trees that we've recently styled and heavily reduced their foliage mass, we need to be protecting. But it gives us an opportune time to come back to pines in particular that are in development, that have been allowed to grow freely for the year. This tree was not pinched. This tree was not post-hardened pruned, because the goal with this was it was a field-grown tree. It was potted 2 years ago. It was styled fall of last year and just allowed to run. And we talk about this all the time with our pines. Now I want to show you the product of just allowing a Scots pine to run and what starts to happen. Jesus, can you zoom in and just show these small little buds all over this branch that are popping as a result of that increased needle mass? So what we see here, we had just two tufts of needles on this, letting them run, letting them accumulate that photosynthetic mass. We've got 2 buds here. We've got 3 buds there. We've got 2 buds there. We've got intermediate buds in this needle length that occurs where the older needles exist. This is exactly why we take our hands off of our pines after we've initially styled them, particularly in the case of a sylvestris or a Scots pine, a single flush short needle pine. Lay out the structure, wire out the secondary branches, let it go. Because when we first styled this, it had a very minimal amount of foliar mass on it. Not a lot of needles. Each of these shoots that was wired was maybe 1 shoot, probably not many more, if any more. And from that 1 shoot, we allow that to elongate. That expansion of that photosynthetic mass creates sugar starch production. That sugar starch production over the fall season, building that vascular tissue. This is really when we see wires start to bite in. But this is also when we start to see, with that vascular expansion, the presence of these adventitious buds. And we get to a point where we say, okay, we're not going to heavily prune this piece. We're not going to heavily reduce the foliar mass. We're just starting to get the motor built. And we talk about building that engine, where we need to get that photosynthetic mass increased, accumulated, start to build that vascular tissue. We get that presence of back buds. We're now going to allow it to elongate next spring, and hopefully with that elongation and that continued vigor that's been built in the tree, we get all of these buds to start to push into actual countable needle mass and expansion further of the photosynthetic mass. That's when we start getting into the opportunity to really build density, to start to build ramification, to expand our secondaries. But there is a major scope of work that we can perform at this time of year, and that is the cleanup, this kind of fall pine cleanup where we're taking a few of the needles off, we're cleaning out some of the dead stuff, the weaker stuff. We're taking anything that's grown so much that it's starting to sag under that needle weight, and we're propping it back up, and we're addressing the shape again and really trying to take this tree to that next level. And again, Each time we touch our tree, we need to elevate the quality of that tree aesthetically, horticulturally, physiologically, etc. This is the goal tonight. Now, I'm just going to focus you guys. I did a little bit of a sample branch here just to show you the difference. When we look at this entire tree, I've kind of come through and I've pruned and I've readdressed the growth that exists on this lowest branch. Obviously, it's the smallest and the most insignificant, which makes it a little bit difficult to see comparatively what happens with a big defining branch. But you can see all the tips are sitting at that level where we're establishing the bottom of the pad. You can see that not a lot of needle reduction has been done, but there is a higher degree of shape-driven aesthetic, and there is a little bit more uniformity and unified mass that starts to indicate that prominent pad. Now, if we compare that to some of these pieces that haven't been touched yet, you notice that the tip is hanging down because of that abundant needle mass. We see some pieces that are weaker kind of hanging down below here, and we've got all of these areas that we need to be addressing and cleaning up. And this is fall cleanup work on a pine. When we start to find that time, this isn't going to compromise winter hardiness if we're very accurate and knowledgeable about what we're doing. We start to step into that realm where we have that time. This tree, after the work tonight, will be able to go right back outside, because again, we're not heavily styling, manipulating, breaking, tearing, or heavily reducing the foliar mass. So let's go ahead, and I'm just going to continue working through this next branch up from this initial sample piece to show you how did I get here when it looks like this. How do we draw it to a point where all of these expanded areas that kind of have no real rhyme or reason or unified concept of aesthetic, how do we manipulate this into a form that actually starts to build and improve that physiology, that horticultural sort of behavior, and that aesthetic increase in quality? Okay, now at this point in time, when I start getting into this, you're going to see, and Jesus, zoom me in here, you're going to start to see where we have these areas where we've got 3 branches. And again, when this was initially styled, there were very weak shoots in these areas, so it wasn't time at that point to be reducing 3s to 2s. In that initial styling, we needed all the needle mass we could get. But as we start to expand, and you see the quantity of this year's needles, big and long, which again, we expect and we want, right? And that's contrary. You're saying short needle, single flush pine. This pine should have short needles. Well, you can see how short the needles were on the other years of growth that existed, and then we get this growth where it just explodes. This is expansion of our foliar mass to get more vascular tissue production, to get more back budding. This is actually what we want when we see a lodgepole pine come out of the mountains, when we see a mugo pine come out of the mountains, when we start to be dealing with these pines that were very short, tight needles, and we see them explode like this. A lot of us panic, oh my gosh, no, my short needle, it's gone. But we have to understand that that expansion of that photosynthetic mass, the size of the needle, the length of the needle, and the number of needles is the step to getting the back budding. That once that back budding starts to expand into actual needle mass, we start to distribute the strength. Strength in pines comes from the roots across a greater number of needles, and they once again reduce not just to the length of the rather starved needles that exist behind it, but even further reduced to give us that really tight, compact growth on a short needle, single flush pine that we're looking for. So in areas where we're experiencing vigor, with this expansion of the needle mass and the knowledge that that needle mass is what creates the sugars and starches that's moved through this branch and can start to, at junctions where we have 3 or more branches, have too much energy moving through that singular junction, we can come back and we can start picking our best 2 strongest pieces or desired lengths and strengths in our branches, taking that 3rd piece out before we start forming those structural issues of inverse taper or excessive swelling at that region, making those corrective decisions now on those healthiest branches. If the branch wasn't healthy and we still needed that needle mass to be giving us a little bit of a boost, then we're not going to be taking our 3s down to 2s because it's not giving us the kind of needle mass and sugar starch production that really promotes the expansion of that tissue and the creation of that vascular swelling that's going to create a structural flaw. Now, once we've started to do that, we recognize, man, these branches, this one has this kind of inverted arc here that's not really attractive. This is where we come back and we say, okay, when we touch this tree to take it to a higher level of aesthetics, we're going to make some of those decisions, and now at this point in time, we're going to stack on wire. Now, when I say stack on wire, my old wire only comes out a turn down one of these 2 branches, but I can use that the fact that that wire gives me a turn of support, I can use that to be the supporting network to be able to apply now a little bit bigger gauge of wire that's able to hold and facilitate the propping up of these shoots, not necessarily angling them up so that they have an upward orientation as if this were a refined tree, because we're still very much in either the development or the secondary phase where we're not looking for this shoot that has this perfect orientation. The goal is not to get a finished tree tonight. The goal is to continue advancing the aesthetic as we build these pieces. So each time that we touch it and each time we go back to further enhance the quality of that tree, we're improving and giving the tree a better chance and opportunity with that upward or at least flattened orientation in this state of development to capture as many photosynthetic resources as possible. And we need to understand that if our shoot is facing downwards, it's not functioning at its peak photosynthetic capacity. So just bringing those shoots up even to level, giving them that maximum amount of sun exposure and the ability to start to allocate hormones and resources towards that expansion is the move at this phase of development. Now you'll notice I'm plucking off a few of the bottom growing needles, but the last thing I want to do is to completely denude the needles that exist all the way around that shoot on the pine. So I'm going to have, at this stage, I'm going to have a few downward facing needles towards the tip of that shoot. I don't want to strip all those off and have a 180 degree or a half-sided shoot on a pine. I always want that radial foliar distribution to exist because this is how pines form their needle clusters. This is how pines produce that resource that we're valuing in that photosynthetic productivity. But just by changing that orientation and bringing those pieces that were hanging down up, we already start to be able to guide. And in stacking our wire, we're now able to come into the main and out towards the sun, into the main and out towards the sun, enhance that flare that creates that pad formation. With that buildup of that needle mass, we now have the ability to insinuate a higher aesthetic in the tree.
Got a couple questions. Are you ready?
Let them rock.
So Kim had said, and this was from a little bit earlier, so I think she's referring to a Scots pine. She said hers is biting wire right now. Should she leave it on or take it off?
So I would say that all hinges on how much is the wire biting. Because if it's just getting tight, and there are times where we don't necessarily have the needle mass built up quite yet to actually start to create the kind of vascular tissue production that's going to cause massive wire scarring to occur. If it's just getting tight, I would say that your wire is just beginning to function and hold the shape of that tree in a form that's going to allow vascular tissue to accumulate in a manner that's going to further solidify that structure. If it's actually digging in and up in the apical region here, let me just rotate real quick and have Jesus kind of focus in. I've already adjusted this wire prior to the stream starting. I just thought, I'll take it off and show the wire scars. You can see where I actually unwired this piece that was starting to dig in pretty quickly, and I've replaced that. I didn't change the wire, I just changed the path of the wire. The wire, as it joins this other branch that was wired in conjunction with the apex, is not biting in and is not causing any damage. This was getting a little bit deep for me. Now, when you guys look at this, you see a wire scar there, you say, oh man, that's bad. But I can honestly say that in 6 months' time, 8 months' time, we're not even gonna see that there is a wire there because the tissue on these trees that are in the developmental process, expanding their photosynthetic mass, young, vigorous, full of vascular resources, that's going to thicken and heal that very, very quickly. Bark is going to form on that as a result of the scar, and we're going to see that actually dissipate and not have to worry about the fact that it's going to mar the eventual shape of the tree. So we let it dig into the point where it holds that. If we still need it, we'll change its course and rewire that piece. If both pieces were digging in too much, we would take it off and apply a fresh wire in a new place on the branch outside of those formed scars that have started to exist.
Could we get another view of the front and then a 360 of the tree?
Oh,
just in case we have people that have just joined us?
Just rocking. Yeah, let me finish wiring this and then I'll go ahead and do the whole song and dance here. Hang on just 1 second. Let me get this positioned and placed into the main and out, into the main and out. That wire, okay, all right. Front of the tree is as it exists in the container, okay? I think this is a beautiful Scots pine, very subtle in its movement. Okay, and we're talking about arranging all of this foliage mass. Now let me go 360 for you guys just so you can kind of see. And here's the other thing. This is something that we touched on and tapped into in the multi-flush pine development from the field. The fact that we've saved a lot more branches than we actually need. And I'm gonna go around one more time. So we've got more branches, more structural branches than we actually need in the final form of the tree. And in the developmental process, we know that that's necessary. And again, we already started the stream off by saying, listen, we saved way more than we actually needed to keep the engine turning. Expanded that needle mass this year. It's causing a lot of vascular productivity. And with that vascular productivity comes a lot of the backbuds that are going to give birth to that next round of expanded needle mass. And as we expand, those buds develop into actual needle mass. The more needles this tree is producing, the more the energy that is created in the root system of a pine. Strength in pines comes from the roots, meaning that the roots are the pumping sort of strength that stores and allocates those resources. The more that we expand this needle mass by the creation of those buds and turning those buds into actualized needles, the more that strength from the roots is distributed. Each needle gets a little bit less, gets shorter, and that's how we go from this shortness as it existed in its field-grown environment to a longer needle. That first year in domestication, that longer needle gives us the production of sugars and starches that build that vascular tissue, that expand that backbudding, and we're going to use that next spring, that expanded photosynthetic surface area and the stored resources that occurred over this fall to really give rise to those buds turning into actual needles. We should see shorter needles next year, but really we're going to see 2021, when we start moving into tertiary refinement in this pine, extremely short needles as a result of getting all of that backbudding, letting it just blow out and get super strong this year, and then turning that backbudding into actualized needle count. That comes with unchecked growth next spring and just that continued expansion, turning of the engine, accumulation of resources. Okay, now one of the other things that happens, and this is very, very common when we start to look at turning a pine from a field-grown piece into a refinable bonsai, you'll notice that I've got this branch here, and then we have a branch that was lost. Now, if you look at this branch, we just had a singular shoot. It was probably very weak when it was wired, and the tree kicked this branch off when it turned out of summer dormancy into fall vascular growth. And a lot of things in terms of the Q&As that we've been dealing with, people have been saying, man, I came out of summer, I think we're into fall, and my pine is losing all kinds of branches. What's going on? This is a very, very common occurrence when we start to talk about the development and evolution of pines, particularly coming out of that summer dormancy into that fall vascular growth. The tree is saying, hey, listen, you're taking a lot of water. I'm having to keep all of this vascular tissue hydrated. You're not paying me back in sugars and starches. I need to be paid back. This root system doesn't have a completely unlimited amount of resources that it can add and pump into the tree. So if you're not paying back, if you're not paying it into the system, we're going to go ahead and let you go. Okay, we're going to let you go, buddy. We think you're great and all, but this isn't working out for us. And that's where we start to come back, get rid of these pieces, and be able to continue driving the development of the pieces that the tree has acknowledged are feeding the system and keeping it in an energy positive state. Taking and accepting what the tree gives us, sometimes that's a branch that we really, really wanted. We didn't want that branch to go. We didn't want that branch to die. And for whatever reason, why was it the branch that I wanted the most that the tree decided to kick off? Well, sometimes that's not a sustainably designed branch. Sometimes it was kind of destined to fail from the beginning, but we left it just to take advantage of any amount of photosynthesis that that branch could give us. But when the tree makes that decision, we just say, okay, didn't exist anyways. And this is a common, very, very common thing to have happen with pines, particularly when we talk short needle single flush pines or long needle single flush pines. That attrition that occurs from that summer shift to the fall vascular productive phase, you'll see some of those weaker branches or even sometimes what appear to be stronger branches kicking off. Maybe they were damaged in the styling process and the maintenance of that, or the vascular conductivity of those resources was damaged in that initial styling, and the tree just says, hey, I'm giving you a lot. I'm trying to heal that. It's not giving it back. I'm going to have to go ahead and let you go. This isn't working for us. We treat that as if it never existed. Okay? Tree doesn't want it. It means it wasn't going to be favorable for the continued evolution and development of our bonsai in the forms that we're striving to achieve. And we're going to go ahead and accept that and make that decision that the tree's made a natural, viable transition of the aesthetic into the direction that the tree is starting to lean. This is where we say this is a collaboration, right? We give the tree a bump and a boost and a direction when we style it initially. The tree gives us feedback. This is some of the tree's feedback. We have to accept that that is a part of it. This is a collaboration. The tree says, hey, I liked what you did with a lot of other things, but that piece didn't work for me. We say, okay, all right, I see where we're at here. That's okay, that's okay. Let's think again then, okay? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to come back to this defining branch, and I'm going to try to get this ironed out, because this ultimately becomes the piece that does give us a lot of guidance for the rest of our shape. I've started on the weak side here, just getting that kind of propped up and primped, but let's really dive into this defining branch, and I'll answer some questions in just a minute, but let me get you guys started, okay? Now, when you look from the side here, one thing that you'll notice is that this branch is growing very far towards the viewer. Now, when we talk about a defining branch, I'm going to rotate this back towards you. Our defining branch is giving us asymmetry, that longest length of foliar mass to the right of the tree, which means we value the length that's occurring over here. We might have to check that length. We might have to make some decisions. But if we start to get bud expansion in this piece that's coming towards us, what we saved for the photosynthetic mass to benefit the increased health of the tree, we now with this expansion have the ability to make some decisions that potentially start to rectify some of the aesthetic issues that we left because we needed that foliar mass to be photosynthesizing. So I'm going to be shortening this piece that's coming towards me. We can make those length adjustments over there. I'll work on that while you guys ask your questions.
Cool. So there was a branch, a small branch you had cut off a minute ago that looked, we had a couple folks in the chat, David and Tax, said that it looked like there were buds on it. Were there buds on that branch?
So there are buds at the base of this. Jesus, can you focus in on this piece right here? Okay, and this is a really interesting, I honestly have not seen this before. This is kind of a little bit of an anomaly. Let's see if I can find where that, I think it was this piece. So I cut, no, it couldn't have been that piece. I don't know where that piece went. Anyways, right there it is. Okay, here we go, okay? So I cut this piece off. It was joined right there. Now there's something interesting here because we have all these buds that exist back here. Now if I just show this, and I'm going to let Jesus recalibrate. I'm going to show you what's happening here. And let me know when you're in there, Jesus. Okay, so what we start to see here is you actually see the shriveling and the wrinkling of this tissue. As this tip is dyed, there's no more water coming through this portion of that branch. And so we're actually seeing that branch void of that hydration starting to shrivel. Now, when we look at the end of it here, you see half of this is green, half of this is brown. Maybe this was damaged in the styling process, or maybe this is just the tree starting to abscise or shed this branch. That living green piece right there, when we come back to this point where we have these buds, says that there is still some resource being allocated there. Now, with that dead branch, will this continue to hold resources over the course of the fall, winter, and push growth in the spring? I don't know, but on a tree this young, chances are that those buds could push, which is why I went ahead and left the stub with the buds on it, because we can see. If it doesn't matter, I'll cut back. This branch is starting to back bud out here towards the foliar mass. It will produce buds along here definitively next year. So we'll see what happens. Hopefully they push. If they don't, no big deal, but I left them just in case.
Matt wanted to know what part of the fall is best for this work, early, mid, or late?
Yeah, so I mean, we're definitely in the late fall, and we talked about the fact that we've got freezing temperatures coming next week, and we also talked about the fact that this kind of work is not going to compromise the winter hardiness or the tolerance of our pines if we do it at this time of the year. And this is, again, we kind of this short needle single flush or just the single flush pine development, creation, secondary refinement. It seems to be one of the more misunderstood and under-discussed aspects of pine cultivation within bonsai. This makes up a great majority of the pine species that we work with. We have a few multi-flush that we've identified and definitively accept as a multi-flush, our Japanese black pines, our Japanese red pines. There are a few North American native pines that do behave similarly but not identical to the multi-flush pines that we're more familiar with in the traditional form of bonsai as it pertains to Japanese bonsai and the species that come from that. But when we start to talk about our Zuisho white pine, we start to talk about our Scots pine, our Mugo pine, our lodgepole pine, we start to look at some of our pinyon pines and we start to say, okay, I've got this short needle single flush pine, it's in development. We know with a multi-flush pine, we can either elongate and allow that to continue developing, or we can decandle in the early summertime and we can get a second flush to be produced. And this kind of forms that general direction: development, elongate. If we're going to start refining, we decandle. When we start to talk about our short needle single flush pines, and we get into this intermediate phase where we're starting to accumulate, we're starting to get back budding. but we still haven't necessarily gotten to a point where we're going to fully be pinching the tree, there's still aesthetic work that has to happen to continue moving the growth that is generated forward. And when we talk about bonsai in general, when a tree grows, if we want that tree to continue moving in the direction with the highest possible rate of development and the highest possible rate of accumulation of energy towards that ultimate objective that we have, then we have to understand when are our pieces and our timing of the year where we can perform scopes of work that start to assist in that push towards that ultimate objective and goal aesthetically that we're trying to achieve. This is one of them for our short needle single flush pines, this cleanup in this sort of mid to late fall period of time where we find that time our other species are relatively done with their productivity. Now we can come back and circle back to this knowing that it's not going to impact their winter hardiness and do this kind of a cleanup. And again, this comes with those buds being present, that needle mass being expanded. We don't want to come back on a tree that's not functioning with a tremendous amount of vigor and all of a sudden start trying to reduce foliar mass, remove needle mass, etc., because it's not giving us the indications that the motor has started turning at a very high RPM. We really want to build the tree up before we get to a point where we start reducing foliar mass. But for this tree is really showing us significant signs of health, significant signs of aesthetic appreciation, and to come back in, relay out these branches, prune back some of the stronger stuff in areas where we've gotten that really strong pronounced budding, and start to give more direction to it is what's going to keep the tree balanced in its continued journey towards that more refined piece that we're striving to achieve. And that's really the objective of tonight's work, is just checking that growth, managing that growth, and moving the tree in a direction where we're utilizing that growth to accomplish as much as we possibly can. Now, when you see me as I'm doing this, you notice that I'm plucking off some needles that are coming off the bottom. I'm cleaning off some of the older needles, not all. And in fact, I'm leaving as many older needles as I possibly can while still creating the space to be able to apply wire to give some of this growth that's not pointing in the direction, the wire that it needs to be managed and handled and driven to a point where it can start to really contribute to the shape and aesthetic. I pruned off that stronger shoot that existed at the tip. It was a little bit too long and disproportionate. I've got two strong tips that I'm replacing it with, and now I'm going to go ahead and help it fit into that space in a manner that allows it to exist within the design that we've conceptualized and continue to drive forward. This is the work that we're trying to perform at this time of year, is just making sure everything we've created can be a part of this design over the course of time. In setting this up in the manner that we're starting to utilize, we actually create a greater likelihood that those buds that have been produced on these branches are going to push, because now we're again creating that sustainable design by bringing those tips up, maximizing photosynthetic efficiency, getting rid of needle mass that's facing down that might not be contributing as much as it's consuming. And this action will improve the viability of those buds that exist around it that have been created via that expansion of the foliar mass.
Before I jump back into these questions, I just want to just kind of refresh everybody's memory, or for folks that are just joining us, we can only take questions from our Mirai Live chat. There's still time to start a free trial. If you want to check out Mirai Live Pro membership, you can join in this chat, get your questions answered. We can't take questions from YouTube and Facebook tonight. Unfortunately, we don't have time. But moving on to some of our questions from Mirai Live Pro chat. Leonard wants to know, at this time of year, how much yellowing is normal on Scots pine?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it depends on where the yellowing is occurring and what that yellowing looks like, because we do start to see the onset of winter color occurring in our trees that have experienced a frost. This is the iron, the nitrogen, the magnesium that create the chlorophyll, the green coloring and the green pigmentation. That is what it gets excited by the sun's energy, and with that excitement forms the energy to break the molecular bonds of hydrogen and oxygen and carbon and oxygen. So now all of a sudden we can reform water and carbon dioxide into sugars and starches that the tree uses for food and growth, okay? So when we start to see those freezing temperatures or those colder temperatures, the plant starts to protect that very sensitive chlorophyll pigmentation by reabsorbing those into the vacuole, which is what gives it winter tolerance and the ability to endure colder temperatures. And that will cause a general yellowing across the tree, potentially doling of the color across the tree. And that is one reason why we would be seeing yellowing at this time. However, if we're seeing yellowing in the form of specific areas, if we're seeing yellowing in the form of just a portion of the needle but not a general color change, then that could be associated with potential weakness, potential root-related issue, water-oxygen issue in the root system, all of the things that we generally tend to look at, acknowledge, and analyze and try to deal with in terms of general bonsai cultivation. So I wouldn't say that we would expect, and you'll notice the color on this, it's been through a freeze already, is definitely a little bit duller. It's lost some of that vibrant blue-green. It is leaning a little bit more towards a yellowish hue, but it still appears very healthy, very vibrant, and it's uniform and universal across the tree. I feel comfortable with that. If you're seeing a significantly greater amount of yellowing, it's probably starting to discuss maybe a little bit of an issue that you're dealing with in the roots. And that issue may be water-oxygen balance, may also be a nutrient deficiency. There's a lot of things when the tree is creating that vascular tissue over the fall season that start to show up as a result of the consumption of those resources or their lack of availability in the soil itself. Okay? Now you'll notice here as I rotate that this piece, this branch that exists inside of or as an addendum to this defining branch is really lacking a lot of strength. Okay, and this is where we start to come back. There's not a there's not a prominent amount of backbudding. You can see how long and leggy, and this was the general state of all of the branches on the tree when it was initially styled and designed, and you can see how they've started to really accumulate interior buds and gain health. But when we get to this point, in the design of our tree, this is a moment where when we have this abundant amount of needle mass and we have this abundant amount of backbudding, we can start to make decisions on these extra structural pieces that we kept as a result of knowing that we need those to perpetuate the growth, to perpetuate the health, and that we needed those until we see the tree starting to make decisions. This is clearly not built to be sustainable. It's got a very healthy, strong branch above it. It's got another branch here. These are very valuable branches in the design. This is not set up to be sustainable, and if it's not producing in the way that we want it to produce, and the rest of the tree is producing to a high degree, this is a moment in time where we can come back in here and we can actually remove this piece just to start to transition out of some of those sacrificial branches that we held to keep the foliar mass in excess. Now I'll leave a little stub there so that my wire still has function because that structural wire is not digging in yet. But once that wire comes off and it starts to dig into this, I can then go back and reform that gin to a much more attractive degree.
All right, let's see here. So this was from earlier when you were kind of working on I think you were working on the same part, but Kim said there are several branches emanating from that part of the trunk. Is there a need to reduce the amount of branches from that whorl?
Yeah, great question. So when we look at the midsection of this trunk, 1, 2, 3, 4 branches. Now all 4 of these branches occurring in a little bit of a different region, slightly different elevation, but this is definitively an area where we're looking at it and we're saying we can't leave that over the course of time. Now is now the time to be reducing these, and when we start to look from the front, we don't necessarily see these becoming thick enough in any one single branch to be causing that trunk to actually swell to a degree that it's going to cause a structural flaw. But this would be the area in the tree that we have to be consistently aware of. The fact that we've got 4 branches at one junction and acknowledging when they do start to take off, we are going to have to pull some of those out to preserve the integrity and the value of this tree. Now, when we start to hypothesize, which ones are we going to remove? This piece coming from the exterior portion of a curve as well as this piece look like 2 valuable pieces in the design that give rise to foliar mass on the left side, and those are going to be imperative that at least one, if not over the prolonged period of time, both of them may exist for a significant time in the design. However, when we look at this one, we notice this coming from the inside of this curve. This is going to be the branch that's going to be thickening and causing that appearance of inverse taper, because as that curve starts to buttress out to the shoulder of that branch as it swells, it's literally going to be pulling the trunk in that direction, and that's where we're going to see the abnormal thickening occur. So we see this branch really ramping up with health. We're not at a point where we're experiencing that structural flaw yet, but I am very aware and taking note of the fact that I want to use this as much as I can to build up that needle mass in terms of driving those back buds into actual needle count next year, I would assume when this tree hardens off next late spring, early summer, that this branch is going to have to go, because at that point, anything that expands on this is going to accumulate vascular resources after it's hardened off, and particularly once we get to the fall season. And next year, I probably will see this swell to a point where it could cause issue. This is going to be my first piece that's going to be removed. Now, over the course of time, when I look at these two, this branch actually has better branching because it's got ramification on the interior. It's got a larger number of secondaries that are starting to backbud and starting to insinuate they're going to ramify. This piece right here, extremely long, and all of my ramification out here at the tip. Will we get buds back in here? Probably. If we leave this needle mass on these pieces that aren't yet causing a structural flaw, that accumulation of sugars and starches that pays it back to the entire tree and mainly the root system will continue to drive the presence of backbudding on these young branches that don't have that mature bark on them yet. So we may see this backbud. I would love for this to backbud, because this piece right here occurs off of a major stump on the backside of this tree. Jesus, can you just show them this right here? Okay. Not super attractive, the way that this branch occurs from a very large sacrifice piece. This was clearly a backbud that then grew in the field, and we cut this back to this knowing that we were going to need to use it. I would ideally like to, coming back to the wide angle, I would ideally like to drive a better ramification and presence of branching on this piece so that I can remove this and utilize this as my counter branch in a more traditional design form that we're taking in this Scots pine to counter and give balance to this really defining branch, giving us that push to the right side of the tree. But we'll see what happens, because we will always choose the best branch. We can make this stump and this ugly origination of that branch interesting and turn it into a feature in the tree, if this is the branch that proves to be the higher performer of the two when it comes time to select. But right now, we're not necessarily at that point where we need to be cutting off. We're not experiencing structural issues. We're going to leave them on.
See, Scott says he has a large field-grown Scots that was repotted into its first bonsai container this spring. Seems to be growing strong, but he wondered if it was safe to do this type of work this year, even though root work was also done this year.
So if it's giving you, and again, this is where we start to say, just because it was repotted doesn't mean that it's not ready for this work. And when we start to look at what are the indications that tell us that the tree is ready for this work, if it's producing a lot of vascular tissue, meaning wires getting tight, if it's been laid out, if it's generating backbuds, which are saying the tree's root system is telling the tree, I have enough to sustain what exists here and grow at the tip, and I have enough to add and support those buds that exist on the interior. If the tree didn't have the root system to support that, it wouldn't be producing the buds that have the ability to turn into foliar mass. That's an important reading and indication. So more than I repotted, is it still safe? Is the tree giving you, is it communicating with you that it has the ability to actually expand and that you should be going through and taking this next step towards evolving the aesthetic of the tree? And if it is, whether it was repotted in the spring or not, it's clearly recovered. If it's giving you those indications, and you're absolutely warranted and free and clear to go back in and perform this scope of work, okay? Let me talk to them about this piece right here, okay? Now, again, you guys are noticing that these older needles here, as you're watching, I'm taking these off of the bottom and I'm really cleaning that up, because as we start to get the expansion of really photosynthetically efficient, longer needles, stronger needles out on the tips, these bottom pieces, these old, weak, spindly pieces, these shorter pieces, these are tired needles. We can't eliminate all of them because they are very much still contributing on a multitude of levels, contributing photosynthetically, contributing hormonally to the allocation and distribution, and so we want to be keeping them, but those bottom-facing ones are not going to be photosynthesizing, and since we've got this superior foliar mass on the tip, we can now start to clean some of that up and manicure that, and it really does start to give a lot more sharpness to the aesthetic and a lot more cleanliness to our tree. When we make these adjustments, you're going to see the tree respond very favorably with the reduction of some of these lesser performing needles, and it will potentially encourage the tree to drive more of those buds into backbudding as a result. The other thing that you'll notice about the backside and this branch on the rear portion of the tree is that it is very, very long. All the foliar mass is extremely far away from the tree. Now this branch here, we already talked about this midsection. We've got 4 structural pieces there. Those 4 cannot exist. At the most, we'll have 2, and we'll try to select the 2 that have the greatest stagger in their origination on the trunk so that they don't come from that same node. Even a slight differentiation will definitely impede the inverse swelling that could form. But this piece down here is a very important piece because it gives us depth to our design. So even though it's not performing as well as we would like, and it would feel, trust me, it would feel really good to cut this off, this is where we have to understand what we're trying to accomplish in the design of the tree. I'm just going to be cleaning up some of these bottom needles. Nothing is going to come off with this. I am getting back budding in tight. In another year or 2, this should be a very capable branch of being reduced, pruned back, and actually brought into proportion to the rest of the tree. We just have to be patient at this point in the developmental phase of any of our pine build. We've got to be patient to allow the foliar mass and the function of the tree to generate the pieces that we need to maximize the branching that we have.
Daniel wants to know if it's too late in the season to expect a safe amount of vascular production after performing a wedge cut on a Scots pine or an Austrian black pine. I know that's not really what we're talking about. Oh, no, Scots pine or Austrian black pine, but assuming they're healthy and vigorous.
So I would say that we probably are at a point in the season where if we perform a major action like that, it's going to need to be greenhoused or protected from freezing temperatures. Now, if you're in a much more mild, moderate climate, then you may be able to get away with that. You don't have freezing temperatures, or you have a very minimal amount of freezing temperatures that you can pull the tree in. It's not an inconvenience. Or maybe you're in a cooler climate, but you have a greenhouse and the capacity to protect. This time of year when we're doing the styling work on our trees, we do have to be thinking very strongly about the fact that if I do this, I do need to protect this. And if you have the ability to, you're safe to, because you still, at this point, we're in mid-October, we're going to be producing vascular tissue in the northern hemisphere through the middle of November. You have another month, and it's really starting with that chlorophyll, with all of those elements, nitrogen, magnesium, iron, being pulled back into the vacuoles. You will see a significant amount of swelling, and you will see the buds continue to form, get plumper, and really start to produce, with that accumulated stored energy, the ability to generate growth next year. So it is still safe to do so, but you just have to understand the repercussions in terms of necessities for aftercare. That becomes the biggest issue at this point in time in the season. Okay, let me walk you guys through this piece right here. Now you can see how big this piece of growth that was generated was. I mean, this is extremely strong shoot. For a short needle single flush pine to be generating a piece of growth that's 4 or 5 inches long, coming out of having been dug from the field, repotted, and then just simply styled for a year, this is phenomenal growth. Now what I'm getting on the interior as a result of that, I've got 2 buds here. I've got 2 buds here. I've got a plethora of buds right here at this junction. I've got a plethora of buds right here at this junction. I've got a smaller branch, and it's budding all over the place on that smaller tertiary piece. Now, if I want to go ahead and try to pull this back into proportion to the rest of the tree, I have everything set up. I have the strength in this branch. I can go ahead and prune this back at this time, and that loss of that terminal energy and that photosynthetic mass could potentially, in a branch this strong, feed the accumulated resources that are going to be stored in those buds to replace that foliar mass that exists. Now, I'm not doing this on medium strength branches, I'm not doing this on weaker branches, but in this instance, I'm very happy to come back into this shoot and take that shoot off, leaving some of that needle mass that was produced this year, but just shortening and reducing the amount of sugar starch production on that piece of growth, knowing that I've got all the buds set up, I've got plenty of older needle mass that I'm leaving intact. That helps pull it back into an appropriate proportion to the tree, and that also starts to redirect that energy that was at the terminus back into the interior portion of that branch. Again, use that one sparingly. That's not a technique to be applied where we cut back every tip on this tree. That's not the information that I'm trying to generate for you guys. But when we have those really strong pieces that have everything set up and a tremendous amount of needle mass still in existence, we can shorten that a little bit. I know I'm not going to get buds right where I pruned, but the goal is to push energy back into 2, 3, 4 buds that exist in each of those nodes, and I am very, very confident that I will see those push as a result of that reduction. Now, let's compare that to this piece here. Okay, we have a piece that I would say is intermediate, maybe slightly stronger, but definitely not as strong as the piece that I just pruned. As a result, when I look at this, I have 2 pieces of ramification here. I've got buds back at this internode. I've got a few very small buds here. This is a different scenario. If I tried to prune any of this off, I don't have the same accumulation of strength, the same thickening, the same vigor, the same bud production, and the same size of bud production. I can't remove or reduce this piece to try and push that growth to the interior. I'm going to leave this long. I'm going to let it generate growth next year yet again before I ever think about pruning it. Okay? So there's a difference there, and the comparison of the two and understanding how we can handle the two is a major scope of this work, because there is no, and I think you guys are probably starting to understand this, there is no rule, there is no blanket statement about how we handle that. It becomes a very objective decision-making process as we walk through this at this time of year to try and continue to do what we can do to advance the aesthetics and the physiology of the tree. So I'm not going to be pruning these two. I did prune this one back because it had that excessive strength, and everything in the branch tells me that it was ready to be reduced.
Next up is Kip. Kip wants to know if you could define freezing temperatures for pines. Is that dipping below 28 for an hour, being in the mid-20s for 3 to 5 hours? Is the finish line for fall work on pines different than deciduous or juniper?
Definitely different, because pines have a much more aggressive storage of sugars and starches. They have a high productivity of sugars and starches. They tend to be far more cold tolerant than most of the other species that we work with. And even when we start to look at, say, a high alpine species like a spruce or like a larch, we definitely know that spruce and larch are pretty much adapted to being covered or having the protection of that snowfall that does give them a little bit more of a buffer. When we look at our pines, pines are capable of being out in the harshest, windiest, coldest, gnarliest conditions, and the thickness of their cuticle on that needle mass is what protects them. The storage of those sugars and starches in their vascular tissue, root system, branches, trunk is what protects them, and that's where we can get away with cooler temperatures, colder temperatures, or this type of work at this season and not have a pine suffer or be more susceptible to winter temperatures. So to come back and quantify that in terms of what are we talking about, I would say that 28 degrees Fahrenheit, if the temperature is going to dip to 28 over the course of the night, you're going to have enough prolonged temperature time below that 32 degree Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius temperature that we definitely are going to see the container freeze, the root system freeze, and some of the tissue that's on the surface of the exterior portions of the tree actually experience crystallization of the water in the vacuole of those cells. So 28 degrees tends to be the cutoff. Is 32 degrees a freezing temperature for pines? No. If temperature hits 32, it's not going to be 32 for long enough for things to freeze. 28 is really that cutoff. So when we dip below 28, we get into 25, we get into 20. We see a more prolonged period of time under 32 degrees, more prolonged period of time with a colder temperature removing heat. Now we see it crystallize, more of the interior tissue starts to crystallize. That's where the sugar starch loading in the vacuole protects those pieces. But when we start to talk about winter susceptibility to pines, we're really talking in the negative temperatures of Fahrenheit. We're talking about negative 15, negative 20 Celsius. Pines are very, very tolerant up to that point if they have a tremendous amount of needle mass on the tree. We're leaving a tremendous amount of needle mass. Even though we're doing some manipulation, reduction, and adjustment, we're really not denuding the tree of foliar mass. I'm not pruning off heavy branches. I'm not choosing to change that structural flaw where there's 4 branches right now because it's not giving me any immediate indication that it's going to be an issue. And so this tree is going to be as tolerant as it was before we started this work. I'm not worried at all about damage occurring. This is something that's very realistic for us to come back in and adjust our trees in a multitude of areas that do experience freezing temperatures and still feel confident that we can leave them outside to fend for themselves over the winter.
Next up is Gary, who wants to know when and what will the next scope of work be for this pine?
Yeah, great question, Gary. I love that. So now that I'm doing this, I'm really setting myself up by performing this work now. Think about this. If you don't take the opportunity, when the opportunity arises, to be adjusting the shape and really building on the aesthetic, what ends up happening, next spring comes, we're repotting all of our trees, our life happens, right? The garden, the landscape, the business, the family, all of these things are things that we've got to be thinking about in terms of they might be taking us away from or decreasing the time we have to get everything done that we're thinking we might be able to get done. And if we just allow this tree to grow as it sits now, all of these stronger areas are going to continue to rifle out, the buds are going to develop, etc. But we do have a little bit of a limited distribution in terms of evening out that strength in the developmental process. Now, next spring, I may choose, if any of these pieces that have buds present on the interior start to elongate, those buds start to grow, I may choose to pinch, or I may allow those to elongate, harden, and come back in after they've hardened and prune back to stimulate that transition of strength. And if I've achieved my developmental goals of elongate, thicken, heal, expand vascular mass for back budding, if I get all that done, I may choose to go ahead and transition that strength from the tip to the interior. But at this point in time, if I've achieved those goals already, not knowing what next spring is going to look like, and again, squeezing this in and saying, hey, this is something that we can do right now because it's not going to, if we do it in a very aware, intentional, and sustainable manner, it's not going to compromise the winter tolerance of our tree. This is something that we can do at this point in time to make sure that we're set up next spring. One less thing to do when we start the repotting process, a very safe scope of work at this point in time in the year, and then we'll move into the decision-making process as it starts to grow next spring and managing that growth depending on how those interior buds that are present now start to behave.
Cool. Next up is Kim. She says she's never seen you unwire anything on the stream for reason of wire bite. Why is that? There was a branch next to where you were working that needs removing. She might mean the wire. That was about 20 minutes ago, but yeah.
Looking. I don't see anything that I'm really frightened by at all because we are kind of at the tail end. I'm going to get a little more thickening. There's a little bit right here. Yeah, no, you are correct, right? But think about if we're using our time in a valuable fashion, would you guys rather I continue kind of going through all of the different scenarios as we encounter them to prune off and clean the foliage and make aesthetic decisions, or would you rather watch me unwire? I generally come back and tackle that stuff the following day after the stream where I need to unwire things. You guys saw the Lebanese cedar, coming back and unwiring that afterwards, really making all the shape adjustments on the stream and the things that are pertinent to helping you guys understand aesthetics. But unwiring on the stream, I would rather spend our time doing something more valuable. So just know that this is going to be a sale tree. And the whole idea of this is showing people how to handle short needle single flush pine, but also getting to see the work that goes into and understanding the strategy of a tree that is going to be available on the web sale that starts on Thursday at 9 a.m. Okay, this is going to be available. Anybody who decides that they want to add this tree to their collection because the structure is phenomenal, the trunk is beautiful, everything is set up. To offer trees that are in different stages of development on the web sale is something that I've recognized is extremely valuable because not all of us can buy a finished tree, not all of us want a finished tree. But some of us do want a pine where we don't have to go through that rigorous process of getting it out of the field, repotting it, running the risk of that repotting or that field digging process being unsuccessful. We still want to build the pine. We want to take advantage. We want to see what a pine looks like when it's been handled correctly and it's got that significant back budding and that motor of growth. And getting to watch the work on it and know exactly where you stand with it can be a really valuable use of our time on the stream. And then in addition to that, just the fact that the short needle single flush variety of pines and genre of pines is something that isn't discussed and taught about enough and still continues to be a mystery. All of those are what led us to do this. But I see this as being a phenomenal tree for anybody to add to their collection who still wants to be the major force in the work in terms of this tree has so much of a journey left to be sort of traveled in its movement towards a bonsai. But it is set up, it is established, and sometimes that's a really fun place to start in a direction where the tree has sort of its original navigation system in terms of the structure determined, and all of those pieces have started to really be implemented and work together to form an awesome initial sort of direction for the tree.
Pablo wants to know, in a tree in this state of formation, do we also have to select 2 buds if we have 3 or more at the tip of the branch? He's got 2 sylvestris right now that are very strong. Each branch has 3 or 4 buds at the tip.
So I would say, and this is a perfect example of that, I've got this radically strong shoot again. When I look back here, I've got 2 small pieces and I've got a tremendous number of back buds. In certain instances, not across the tree, but in certain instances, I am very motivated to select. Now, this piece that exists right here, I don't have a group of 3 along this branch. I've got a secondary here, I've got a secondary here, and I've got my strong tip. I don't have as many back buds along that piece, so I'm not going to shorten this big tip, okay? And there are areas in the tree where I am leaving 3s. Structurally, I'm leaving this section of 4 right here. So I don't think that it is the time where we do all of that selection. Again, this is part of the journey. It's been styled structurally once, it's expanded, we've got budding, we've got things happening in the stronger areas. If we've got 3s, we can definitely select down to 2s at this point in time. In weaker areas where we've got 3s, not going to be causing an issue, no need to reduce that foliar mass because again, the priority is keeping the momentum, keep pushing that tree forward. When it comes time, when they are starting to swell in those areas, that's when we come back and remove them. And that means we've maximized their ability to contribute to the stored energy in the root system and contribute to the development and evolution of the tree. So it's a paced process. It's not a one size fits all across the whole tree process to be kind of taking all of this and saying, okay guys, now that this is back budding, we cut everything back to 2s. All your 3s come back to 2. That's not what I'm saying. We're not there yet. We're not at that point where we do some big, broad brush stroke. And I think when you look at the way that pines are typically taught, that's almost an unspoken sort of assumption of most bonsai practitioners. You just inherently take 3s to 2s or else it's going to swell. But I do, and I want to insist on being very objective about that execution, knowing that removal of those pieces of foliage, when you're trying to get a tree to grow, to backbud, to thicken, to develop, that can be the impediment that stops, slows that process down, or when a tree is particularly susceptible in a weakened condition, that can be the action that actually kills the tree, reducing those 3s down to 2s when you don't have the foliar mass to sustain the tree. So if we can keep them on and they're not causing issue, I recommend doing so because it does increase the rapidity with which we build that tree, and that's where it becomes a very intelligent, objective decision-making process. Okay, so here's a perfect example of that. I've got these 2 small lateral branches. I've got this big, long, singular shoot here. Now, in the middle of that, it's carrying the same thickness behind it, and it's carrying the same thickness through this piece. There's a little bit of junk right there. Oh, that's the tip of the wire. That's making it look thick. I got it. Okay, so you guys might be looking at that and saying, what about all that stuff? But that's the tip of the wire. Okay, so there's no inverse swelling taking place here right now. Well, I don't have any backbuds along this branch. If I want backbuds along this branch and I shorten this and I just leave 2, I've just reduced, because I would take this central one out to get a more compressed branch formation, I've just reduced my greatest amount of photosynthetic mass here. So I don't want to take that action right now. I would rather save that, let that build further vascular tissue, let that expand the ability for that to backbud. We still do have a little bit of time now, but we're going to have a lot of time next spring as this starts to push out growth to really maximize the productivity of this piece. Okay? Now, another situation right next to it. Here I've got 3. I've got 2 lateral and I've got 1 vertical. This 1 vertical is going to cause radical swelling much faster than having all 3 of these be lateral. I will come back and take this one off. I've got a little bit of backbudding. I've got backbuds here. I've got backbuds at the shoulder. So this one is behaving. Even though this is stronger, I'm still not getting that tissue to a point in sugar starch production where it's giving me the kind of backbudding on this branch that I want. This one is, and I had that vertical piece coming out of that 3-point origin. I'm going to go ahead and take that off. And again, objective decision-making process at each point. Are we getting what we want? Do we have an issue yet? No, we don't, and we are getting what we want. We can make the decision to thin down. We don't have a structural issue, but we've gotten what we want. Take it down to 2. You already got what you want. I don't have a structural issue, but I haven't gotten what I want. Leave them on. Leave them on. That'll help you get those backbuds developed. That'll help you build that vascular tissue.
Kurt wants to know how to deal with overbudding. A couple people asked about that.
Overbudding. Now explain that to me.
Seems like a good problem to have, Kurt.
This is first world problems right here. Okay, what is overbudding in bonsai? Because I have buds that are occurring in pairs of 2s all the way up each node of a lot of these branches. Let me take you guys back and just show you one really prominent one just so that we're orienting correctly. Okay, all right. Jesus, can you see here? Okay, I've got 2 here. I've got 2 here. I've got 2 here, 1 on top and 1 on bottom. I've got 2 here, 1 on top and 1 on bottom. Okay, is that overbudding? Because I would say, man, I'm going to let all of those buds originate. I'm going to let them open up. I'm going to let them harden off. And if I need to come back in and thin, or I need to come back in and make some adjustments structurally, that's that post-flush hardened pruning that we talk about with our short needle single flush or our long needle single flush pines, where we come back in and we adjust. The equivalence to that would be the shoot selection and needle plucking that we do on our multi-flush pine. So if I've got a ton of buds, I'm going to let all of them open up. And then once they've hardened off, I'm going to go back in and make that decision on that piece to really try and take advantage of the growth that occurred. The risk in saying, I've got overbudding, I'm going to thin the buds. This is a common thing that I hear. I've got 3 or 4 buds. Jesus, take a look at this tip. Okay? I've got 3 buds at this tip. I don't want all 3 buds to elongate. Why not? Why wouldn't we want all 3 buds to elongate? That's more photosynthetic mass. Well, isn't it going to swell? Not originally, not initially. If we leave it on over the course of time, it'll swell, but as those 3 buds come out, they harden off next spring. We come back in, we select down to 2. We've got too many buds along this branch that open up. We come back after it's hardened off, we select down to the stagger pattern and distribution that we aspire to. There is no overbudding, there's just opportunity created by the presence of all of those options in the shape and design of the tree. So I would say, how do you handle overbudding? Celebrate it. Celebrate the overbudding. That's what you've been working for. That's why you built all of this needle mass. That's why you've allowed this tree and given it the kind of care, balance of water and oxygen, supplemental nutrition that has given it the ability to expand its vascular mass to be able to create all of those opportunities for you. That's how we build a tree. This is exactly how a pine is built, getting a prominent number of buds. And again, if we want to come back, let's speak the language of the tree. I've got a ton of buds on a branch. I've got a ton of buds universally across this tree compared to where it started. I've got so many more options than I originally had. That is the tree telling me, hey, in the root system, the epicenter of strength, the piece that has to supply all of this potential needle mass with the water, I'm not going to build needle mass. I'm not going to put buds out there unless I have the vascular tissue, i.e. the root system, to support it. So when we start to see all that, that's the roots, that's the tree telling you, hey, listen up. Listen, I got enough to sustain and add. I have enough to sustain what I have, and I have enough to add more. I'm set up. I'm ready to go. We're not going to tax the tree. We're not going to exhaust the tree because plants don't have a credit card. They can't put on all of that growth and then be like, shit, I didn't think about that. How am I going to pay for my new jet ski, right? It's like, it doesn't look like that. The plant is only putting on those buds when it's got all of the systems in place to be able to allow them to expand, to develop, to start to transpire. And really what the plant is looking at is, it's been a great year. We've invested, we've set up we've built in our back end, we've set up our bank account is looking mighty fine. Let's go ahead and expand. Time to expand, time to franchise, right? Let's build this thing now. We've got all of our infrastructure set. Let's make it happen.
Let's see. Next up is Paul. Paul wants to know if you're going to continue fertilizing over the winter. He had heard that conifers will continue to photosynthesize during winter as well.
Where we're at in the Pacific Northwest, the thing that, and I'm going to come back to that, okay? I'm at a critical point here again where I've got a junction of 2 branches at the same node. Now down here where these are really prominent primary pieces of structure, right here where we've got these 4, I know if I remove any one of these, I'm going to lose a significant amount of needle mass. Okay, I'm at a junction here where these are right next to each other, and I look at this branch and I see, yeah, you have some needles on it, but you're not that great of a branch. And I've got these world-class branches coming off of this piece that most definitely is the dominant of the 2 pieces to keep right there. What am I going to do? Am I going to continue to nurse this thing along as if it's going to add when I've got this all-star that's trying to invade that space? No, this is a situation where I'm not going to lose much by taking this off, and it creates the space for the piece that I actually want to build to really thrive. I'm going to go ahead and take that moment here, this opportunity, to remove this structural piece, improve the structure of the tree, and know that I'm not setting the tree back in terms of a significant loss of that photosynthetic capacity. What did I do with that? Oh, here it is. Okay, so I'm going to take this one off, and this flies in the face of saying, hey, I'm not going to remove any of these 4, but here, now I've got this to replace it, I'm going to go ahead and take the opportunity. Every time we're objectively analyzing that piece. Now, coming back to Paul. Ask me Paul's question again.
Will you continue to fertilize over the winter?
There we go. Okay. I will not continue to fertilize over winter, and here's why. If I lived in California, if I lived in Texas, if I lived in Florida, if I lived in an area where we didn't experience a true blue dormancy, an actual slowing down of the metabolic activity to a point where the tree is essentially dormant and inactive, then I probably could benefit potentially, although you'd want to ask yourself, what are you trying to accomplish? I probably could benefit from fertilization over the winter period of time, particularly if I'm developing a tree. I'm trying to get thickening, I'm trying to get stored resources for more backbudding, etc. However, when you're in a cold weather area, conifers will continue to photosynthesize if it's above freezing temperatures, even above 40 degrees, 42 degrees. Pines we typically see working at temperatures that are actually colder than our other species. So generally we would say, look, if it's above 32 degrees, chances are a pine is going to be functioning. However, you also have to think about what about the metabolic activity or what about the biological activity that would be making that fertilizer actually available in the forms that the plant needs to take it in. And that's where we see colder temperatures start to disable the effect of fertilization in colder areas, because even if the tree is active, the biology may not be, and that fertilizer typically tends to become more organic matter percolating through your oxygen spaces than it does fertilization that's improving the health of the tree. Okay? So I don't, and I've tried it. I've tried fertilizing extremely late. I've applied a fertilizer dose at the end of November on one year where we had a really warm fall. It totally came back and bit me in the butt, because once it did turn cold, everything stopped, fertilizer didn't break down anymore, and it turned into this mud sludge on the surface of my container. I've found that to be more harmful than I have beneficial, and that's why I don't do it anymore. But again, if you're in a warmer area, there is the potential for that to potentially pay it back if you're trying to develop. Now, the flip side to that, let's talk about all aspects of that question. The flip side to that is to say, hey, if I'm trying to refine a tree, I'm trying to build proportional secondaries on a tree, should I be fertilizing over the winter time if I could? I would say, man, if that's what you're trying to accomplish, more refinement, controlled growth, a little bit better transition of taper base to tip, I'm probably not going to be trying to pump this thing full of fuel that's going to be supplementing the already aggressive development of vascular tissue and thickening of the tree. I'm not going to be fertilizing in that, whether I can or I can't. I probably don't want the kind of energy that would generate in the tree, and so I'm going to go ahead and hold back from the sheer perspective that that's not what I'm trying to accomplish. Okay? So be very careful, because we do tend to, as Westerners in the Western mind, hey man, if 1 drop is good, 2 drops is better. And when we think on that far side, if 1 drop is good, 5 to 10 drops probably necessary. Be careful with that, because that is the mentality that has led to a lack of ability to refine our trees over the course of time.
Leonard says that there are sections where the branches seem uniformly thin. Do you have a method for encouraging some branches to thicken while others hold back?
Totally. Doing exactly what I'm doing here. Checking that growth, reorganizing, making sure that everything has its space to photosynthesize and exist sustainably inside of the design. And then I think we have to look at the fact that if it's still thin, then we haven't accomplished our developmental goals, which means we wouldn't be pruning back the tip, which means that we would be leaving as much needle mass as we possibly can on that branch specifically, because we know that needle mass is the only way that we turn thin into thick. We have to be photosynthesizing, we have to be expanding the photosynthetic mass. That's what generates the vascular tissue. There's no other part of the tree that's going to assist a piece that's overly thin to getting thicker. It has to come from the needle mass that occurs on that piece of growth where that thin branch exists. And that's where we start to say, look, the only recipe to a thin branch is thickening it by getting the needle mass on that tip to expand. And again, when we get that expansion, that is what gives us backbudding as well. So you say, how do you assist in backbudding? You expand the needle mass. I mean, when you think about this tree and you look at the amount of needles that are new on the tip of this branch, what used to exist versus what exists now is literally an exponential increase in the photosynthetic surface area. Consequently, we've got wire getting really tight here. Consequently, we've got buds all along that branch. That is what gives birth to and gives rise to adventitious budding in the presence of new material to really extend and expand our ramification, build on that photosynthetic productivity. And if you're a tree, you have to think about this, right? I've got a piece that clearly is photosynthesizing very effectively. It was transpiring a lot, so I sent a lot of water and nutrition there to meet the demands of that transpiration. And lo and behold, with that resource, it produced a large amount of needle mass, and now it's transpiring even more, but the payback is I'm getting a ton of sugars and starches. I'm gonna put more growth there. At that piece that's using all that water and giving me all those sugars and starches, I'm gonna give it more ability to do that. That's my performer, right? That's your all-star. So when we try to build smaller, weaker branches, for example, if we come down to these bottom pieces that are still quite thin, they've got one back bud on this piece. I see 2 back buds on this piece. Okay, I want 5. I want 10 back buds on this piece. I want the problem of having too many buds, over budding. I want to see that happen on every branch. The only way I do this is allowing this next year to grow unchecked, to give it the right sun exposure, balance of water and oxygen in the root system, expand the needle mass here, or this will never get thicker.
Chuck wants to know, with regards to the discussion about overbudding, what about multi-flush pines? He's let a Japanese black pine that was having some difficulties grow out for a season, and it's responded with numerous shoots, pushing 3 to 5 buds at the tip.
Yeah.
Should he select down to 2 now, or let them grow out next year and select down to 2 shoots to decandle in the summer?
Great question, great question. So we're not quite there yet with our multi-flush. We typically circle back to the multi-flush once we get into November and we've gotten to the tail end of that massive production of vascular resources. Here's what I would say, Chuck. Even though you let it grow out and you've got all those shoots, I would come back and shoot select when it's finished adding its vascular tissue, which is going to be triggered by daylight length in our multi-flush pines because black pine does typically tend to grow in warmer areas in a coastal environment. So daylight length has to be triggering their behavior more than temperature. But when we get that massive accumulation of sugar and starch production, you can go back in and shoot select. You can do some needle plucking to balance the distribution of energy on that tree. And the product of that is going to be next spring, next summer, you're going to have a ton of adventitious buds set up, whether you see them or not. When you decandle next year, the amount of interior growth you're going to have to work with to regain or even improve that tree is going to be exponential to what you've had to this point in that tree's life. And that's where we say, listen, when we're trying to get back budding on a multi-flush pine, so many people interpret the decandling process as the methodology that induces back budding. This is not true. The decandling process merely brings the back budding that was present as a result of that vigorous growth to a visible form for us to actually see. And that's where we make that inaccurate association. I decandled, I saw buds. Those buds were already there. They were set up by the abundant vigorous growth that existed. Decandling triggered their initiation of resources to bring them out and really show them for the ability that they have, but they had to be created first because we can decandle a really, really healthy tree and not get back buds forming on it if we didn't allow them to accumulate over the course of the previous season. That is why we wait until November to do the shoot selection on multi-flush pine. We want to build that vascular tissue that supports the continual incremental increase and improvement presence of back budding.
So Chuck just wanted to clarify, by shoot select, in this case, do you mean bud select? The buds are at the tips of the shoots. He didn't decandle this year.
Oh, so he's not saying there's 3 mature shoots that bear their own independent needle mass. He's saying each shoot has 3 or 4 buds
at
on
the
it.
tip. He said the tree was too weak to decandle, so yeah, numerous shoots pushing 3 to 5 buds at their tips.
Ah, okay. No, you're not going to... So, and this goes back to like, hey, I've got too many buds. What the heck do I do? And it's like, congratulations is what I would say, right?
Good job.
If you've got 3 to 5 shoots at the tip of your branch, leave them on. Let them all push next season. Because chances are, in letting that recover, and this happens on multi-flush pines all the time, in letting that pine recover, what ended up happening as a result of that recovery was that you got all of those buds and the strength of that tree bolstered. You want to let that come to fruition. Then you come back and decandle. Then you get all those back buds. And if that tip is no longer usable in the aesthetic of the tree, you're going to have so much to cut back to that you're going to improve the compactness, the structure, the ramification of that. Don't come back and start thinning now. That's the greatest course of action to weakening a tree. I'm going to take the 3 buds at the tip, I'm going to pluck off 2 of them. I've never seen that technique bear fruit. I've heard it a lot, I've seen it a lot. When I was in college, that was the gospel in California. That's how you handle pines. Totally annihilates pines, right? Not the technique to be utilizing. Let the tree make the decision, let it push the growth, let it take advantage of everything that it's set up. It has enough to sustain and add. Take advantage of the payoff when we do get to decandle those in the late spring, early summer. That's when you'll get the value of all of those pieces.
Cool. Well, we are caught up on
Okay.
questions if you want to just go for it.
Perfect. Well, I'm kind of just rocking right along at Ryan's pace. So now we're getting to a point where we're starting to get up into the upper canopy of the tree, and we're starting to see areas where I've got a 3. Jesus, are you in here tight for me? Okay, I've got an area of 3, 1, 2, 3. This third one is the main piece, and then I've got another area of 3 right here. This is vigor. This is what we call vigor, okay? Now, at this point, this being super vigorous, I don't want this growing over these branches down below that are quite important for the health of the tree. I'm going to take back some of the strength by pruning off the bottom growing piece and the strongest tip of this bunch, because these are strong to a degree where if I leave 3s and I don't separate them down to 2s over the next month, there is enough needle mass in this abundance that it could continue to swell to a point where it's going to give issue. And next year, as it's producing its spring growth, it definitively would swell to a point where it's going to give issue. So this is a moment where I would say it's necessary to come back in and check that quantity of buds and really manage that growth in a way that allows us to control the thickening in that region. And we're going to see that. It's present here. There's some pieces up in the upper apex that we need to manage. So this is a moment where I would say that absolutely is the appropriate technique. Now, we made choices objectively lower in the canopy where we chose to remove them. We had that vertical piece on the 3. We had another 3 that had that big abundance, and I pruned that tip back to stimulate the buds. But those were the only 2 areas yet where we've really focused on those 3s. This is the first time we've reached that kind of strength where we start to see just an accumulation that's so great that it could potentially cause a structural flaw. Let's head that off before it becomes an issue, because this branch is very important for the eventual shape of the tree. Now, this structural piece is also at a point in the tree where it's got another opposing branch and the apex originating from this junction. Here's what we know. We know at some point, potentially in the very near future, because of the vigor that we're seeing here, that we're going to have to be removing one of these 3 pieces. And we'll show you those. Let me just get this wired. Let me cut this off, make this look super nice, or as nice as it has the ability to look right now, which is kind of nice, but not super nice. We're not at the super nice point yet, okay? Okay, Jesus, focus right in here for me. Okay, so now we see this junction. We've got our apex here. Obviously, our apex is a priority. We've got this piece here that has all this strength. We've got this piece here that's just occupying this really pertinent amount of space here. Now, this becomes tough because, and let me turn this to the wide angle so that you can see it. Okay, this becomes tough because we don't want to get rid of this branch. It fills a massive amount of space here. We don't really want to get rid of this branch. It fills a massive amount of space here. And we don't want to cut the apex off because obviously it's very important for the continuation of line base to tip. I personally find the movement that occurs up through this apex very important and pivotal to the quality of the tree because we get so many changes of direction in that last 30% of the trunk. Boom, 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 okay? So when we look at this, how do we start to formulate what we're going to remove and how we're going to deal with its removal? Well, this is where these branches up here come back into a concept of development, because by dropping this down, continuing to elongate and build this piece, this is what's going to fill in the space that removes this piece, okay? By continuing to evolve, I removed this structural piece so I didn't have to reduce this all-star here. It's now going to grow into that space. We're going to close it on the top. We're going to build on the bottom. Pretty soon, as these fill out, ramification continues to increase. We're not going to need this branch anymore. We're going to probably have to remove it prior to not needing it anymore. We're not at the point where it's definitively causing a structural issue I can't prune out, so I'm going to leave it. But I'm already thinking this branch has to go in the eventual shape of the tree. How am I going to do that? I'm still continuing these pieces in development because that's what's necessary to get rid of that structurally flawed area of the tree. This is forethought, thinking ahead to what is going to happen, accepting it, and developing a plan for it. Okay. Whew. Lots of talking. Ryan's
Yeah, I mean, I guess just in case, I know we've probably had people kind of come in halfway into the stream, but just in case it wasn't clear, this tree is going to be included in our tree sale, which starts on Thursday, this Thursday at 9 a.m. Pacific Daylight Time. There's going to be a whole variety of trees up for sale. You can find that on our web store, goods.bonsai.com. You won't be able to find anything now because the trees don't go up until 9 a.m. on Thursday.
Yeah.
But this is one of them. This is the sneak peek that you're getting.
The sneak peek while we also tackle a pivotal piece of knowledge for single flush pines. Okay, let's come back to this area where we were working within. All right, now we get to a point again where we have a 3 and another 3. Again, this one was vigorous. We had to make a decision here. This one is also vigorous. Now I'm going to key off of what I already have. I want the length here because it helps give me flow, works well with my defining branch. It's not as long as the defining branch. Let me show you guys that from the wide angle. Okay, you can see that this is here. My defining branch is here. Let me get rid of that. Okay, so I can use this length. This length is valuable to me right there. Okay, and you see that it goes out. Eventually, if this piece on the inside is going to go, we'll come back in to pick this branch up for depth and then move back out again. That out, in, out movement in the silhouette. We don't want one big singular length on each of these branches that creates a solid silhouette. We want to move out. We want to come back in and pick up those branches for depth. We want to move back out again. I'm set up right here, and I know this is going to come out. We already talked about this area where we have the 4 structural flaws. So when I look at this, I know that I can keep this length and it fits into the shape of the design, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to plan my reductive pruning or my structurally corrective pruning based on this piece on the inside that doesn't have another branch sitting in that area. We have 1, 2 right here. We have 1, 2, 3 right here. I'm going to be taking off the piece that is directly on the same side as this branch. And I'm starting to key off of this because I go from the left of the branch to the right of the branch, to the left of the branch, to the tip, which means now I eliminate this piece on the bottom, and I go stagger pattern, left, right, left, tip, to set up that alternating pattern that gives me the very best branch formation if I can swing it. Now, if this piece right here that I cut off was superior to this piece, I don't have to follow the stagger pattern against all other reasonable objective thought. I can definitely have 2 branches on one side of this elongated line. So had I saved the shoot on this side, I would be flaring the branch like this to show that and give it space. But because this piece was of a value, staggering that creates the best setup of that branch alteration if I can. And if I'm not losing too much or sacrificing quality to achieve that stagger pattern, I will prune to do so. And that's what you just witnessed in that decision that was made.
Chuck wants to know, do you ever use low nitrogen fertilizer on pines in the fall for which you want to promote finer growth in the spring, or is that a strategy reserved for deciduous trees? If it is applicable to pines, does it apply to both single and multiflora species? Piggybacking on that, Kim wants to know if you can recommend any non-liquid low nitrogen fertilizers.
Non-liquid, no low nitrogen fertilizers. Oh man.
Solid only.
Huh?
Solid only.
Solid. Yeah, Ian was here today, who we've been working on the soil biology with, and I totally dropped the ball on asking him about low nitrogen recommendations, liquid and solid. But I will be talking to him in the next couple days, and I will hit him up for that and get you guys an answer, because that is something you've been asking for that I have not delivered on, and I apologize. So Kim, I don't have anything, but I will be asking. It is on my radar, and Ian and I have been working on the continued soil biology issue. As far as would I apply a low nitrogen feed to get finer growth next year on a pine? No, but I would be controlling my dosage, because you know that over the fall season, that accumulation of vascular tissue is the stored resources that are a product of photosynthesis, sugars and starches, okay? So if you're supplementing that and you're driving that with heavy feeds over the fall, you're going to naturally ramp up the stored accumulation to give you a lot of growth next spring. Well, you can back off on that quantity, you can slow down on that timing, the number of applications over the fall, to be able to get a more controlled amount of growth. And you can take this to the far side of things being, what if we're cultivating a literati pine? We're cultivating a literati. It's slender, it's delicate. I don't want candles that are this long next year on my delicate literati pine. Well, the container size is going to control that to a degree, but your supplemental nutrition, that accumulation and application of nutrition, is what's going to also be dictating to some degree the metabolic activity that produces that quantity of available sugars and starches. And in that, you can pull back, you can elongate the timing between applications, and you can control how much resource is stored as a result. And the other thing we can do to control that is we can start to manipulate how much time we leave those needles on a multi-flush pine, like a black pine, like a red pine. Do we wait until the end of November to shoot, select, and needle pluck, or do we do it a little bit sooner so that it doesn't have as much needle mass accumulating as much sugar and starch production and causing that thickening over the fall season? I would be careful playing with that gas pedal. of manipulating the foliar mass, but I want to put it out there as a high-level methodology and technique you can utilize to reduce the resources. Be careful. If you over-reduce and you decrease the amount of resources, number one, your tree is going to be more susceptible in the wintertime, but number two, you do run the risk of slowing the engine down to a point where it's tough to get it ramped back up. So I say that with caution, but now you're aware. Okay, so I know I want these pieces up in the upper apex to not only be continuing to elongate, but I want to continue to drive this downward angle of the branch so that I start to build this in this space. And if I can start to even almost choke out this branch with this piece building above it, I only increase and supplement that notion that I have to transition over the course of time, make that commitment to that move so that we get that happening. And that's kind of where I'm going when I drop down and I'm continuing to elongate here. Now I've got a perfect scenario that talks about that pair of three, because we're super vigorous here, trio of three here, where we're talking about, okay? Over on that other branch, I had gone from this piece here that existed on the left to this piece here, and I had taken out this piece to create that stagger pattern, left, right, tip. Okay, but here when I look at this left, and then I look at this left versus right, this left side is far more strong and vigorous, and this right side is super wimpy and weak. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take out that wimpy, weak right side, and I'm going to flex this branch to space those now, drive that towards the front to occupy that space, and in doing so, I've set myself up now with two superior buds or shoots or branchlets that are on the same side. The adjustment to that is now I have to fan those out in this direction, and that influences the form and position of this piece as a result of that decision that we made. Well, I'm really glad that serendipitously worked out. I talked about it, now we get to see it.
Perfect.
That worked out well. So well. Short needle single flush pines. You know, one of the things, and I think one of the motivations that people have in cultivating black pine and red pine as just this like pillar and staple of bonsai, obviously we love them because if we've entered the bonsai practice being inspired or influenced by Japanese bonsai, we've seen them a lot. It's almost like our brain is branded to want a multi-flush pine. It meets our notion of what a pine is, right? But I think beyond it, we don't really know how to cultivate short needle single flush pine and build and develop. It's like, it's a mystery. We know how to decandle. We know how to needle pluck. We're cool, man. I don't know how to pinch as well. I don't know what to do with all these back buds. I don't really know what time of year to be working on a short needle single flush. But when we look at it, if you take how far this tree has come in a year and you compare it to a multi-flush pine, I would say this is equivalent or potentially even outperforms based on the fact that we're just getting so much of that budding and so much of the growth is usable. Okay, Jesus, you in tight here for me? I'll let Josh get in tight here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to swing this branch over towards the front. I'm now going to flare this over towards the front. And notice that space that I've bought. The space between this and the tip and the space between these two, 1 finger length. It's equivalent. That's what I'm trying to illustrate. It's equivalent. So I've flared that to get that movement that brings that ramification out to a usable form. If I feel like this is creating a circular mass here, I go into the main, tuck in, and then I push out at the tip to close down that crotch and give me that acuteness. Now I've got a branch going. These are going to continue to elongate, build over this piece. This is going to expand in here. That comes off. Love it. Love it. Sometimes it just works. Sometimes the system just works. Okay, I'm going to take off this shoot right here at the top. That is going to cause it to swell. That vertical piece, not so good. And then let's come back to the branch on this side. Now, we've already talked about, okay, when you look from the front, we've already talked about the fact that we have the length here. We can use this length here. We probably need to continue that thematic up in here, getting a little bit more length and directional insinuation to the right. So when I start to look at that, I've got a big trio of 3 right here in the middle of the branch. I could reduce this really strong tip, but that would be shortening that branch. And we've determined in design, again, when I look at this, I don't want to reduce the length of that branch. That starts to create that T-Rex arm on the side of the tree to the right side that we need that flow and movement. Now that flow is here, that flow is reinforced here, that flow is further driven home in this area of the tree. So now when we come back to this, okay, and I'm going to orient towards Jesus so he can show you this, I'm going to drop this down, Okay? Now we start to look again at how we have these buds distributed. Because when I look at this, if I'm going to be bringing this, if this is generating flow, the front of the tree is towards me, if this is complementing and supplementing the flow, I probably want this branch coming slightly towards the front. If it's coming slightly towards the front, this piece starts to be on the inside of this arc that this branch is making to come towards the front. I'm going to take that piece off. So now I go here, here, and again, I get into this scenario where I've got these two pieces. Now, I don't know which one of these is going to outperform the other. And on the previous two branches, we've made that selection. But because these are so small and so delicate, I'm going to leave both of them. And I'm going to adapt my styling once these get to a strength and thickness where this starts to swell too much to make the decision of which one I remove. But having removed this interior piece now allows me to flare forward. I can come back in and I can take off those older needles off of the bottom. Okay, I've got this piece occurring off the bottom I'm going to go ahead and get rid of. Okay, keeping those older needles intact. Continue letting those drive those resources forward. Now I can link this up to the tip to adapt and adjust that tip, and all of a sudden we've got that rectified up in that upper region of the tree.
You ready for a couple more questions?
I'm ready.
So Leonard wants to know, on the branch you were just profiling, does that mean that you will partially decandle to elongate?
Well, this is not a multi-flush pine, so maybe I should be very careful in talking about multi-flush pine here, because this is single flush, right? If I confused everybody, I apologize. This is a short needle single flush pine. It is not a multi-flush. We do not decandle. There is no decandling here. This is either pinching or elongate, harden, and pruning, and we're talking about fall cleanup of our developing single flush short needle pine. Okay, so if I cause confusion, I'm sorry. We kind of got into the realm of like crossing over pine knowledge to like all pines, and I felt like we were there together, but I recognize I can go too far too fast.
Well, and it's tough when we've got, people coming in and out and all that. So our next question, though, so on this topic, Corey says, this is short needle single flush. What about long needle single flush, like a limber pine? Is this work applicable as well because it's single flush?
So this is where we cross one of those thresholds. Just like we're saying we don't decandle a short needle single flush pine, they will not produce a second flush. We know that if we've allowed this kind of accumulated needle mass on a long needle single flush pine to create and accumulate sugars and starches to this point over the season, if we've allowed that to happen on a ponderosa, on a limber pine, we have a problem in doing this work at this point because we've allowed a greater amount of needle mass to create an abundant amount of stored sugars and starches in the vascular tissue. As a result of that, if we reduce any of that foliar mass on a long needle single flush pine this late in the fall, next spring's growth is going to be astronomically long. We're going to tap back into that elongating component of that long needle single flush capacity. So we will elongate the needles as a result of reduction on a long needle single flush pine doing this. This is not the time. We missed it. It happened, for us it happened earlier this year, happened at the tail end of August, the first week of September. Typically it's the middle to end of September that it happens, so that happening earlier, we had to adapt and adjust to that and really maximize the work that we did on our long needle single flush pines in that earlier period, and it's cued by older needles dropping off of the tree, third year needle loss, the time we can go back in and prune and not suffer elongation because we prune that growth off before it accumulates that stored sugar and starch that dictates next year's growth. So this is not something we would do on a long needle single flush pine, very specific to the short needle single flush pine genre, okay? Last piece here, we're all the way at the apex. Now this is where we really get to evolve the apex. Again, apical stream next week, you are not gonna wanna miss that. That one's gonna be an absolute monster. So many people struggle with apices. How do we style apices? How do we build apices? How do we evolve apices over the course of their the cycle? What's happening? Oh, okay. Sniffles. Apexes? Oh, apices make us excited. I got you. Yeah, pretty pumped about that stream, are you? Yeah. Okay, all right. Okay, so when we're starting to talk about that, and again, that stream coming, it's going to show you how to build an apex in every stage of development, the initial styling, structural, the secondary expansion, the tertiary refinement. When we start to look here, this originally was just one shoot. One shoot that was laid down almost as if it were a flat branch, okay? We want a little bit more thickening, but we don't want this to continue carrying forward. And now we have all of these other shoots that are starting to create lateral opportunities and growth. I'm gonna go ahead and at this point, I'm gonna take off this overly elongating piece. Now, some of you might be saying, whoa, if you take that off, you stop this thickening process. Don't you want that to be thicker? I do. At some point in the creation of an apex, we've got to decide, when do we stop the elongation process as we set ourselves up with these lateral pieces of branching and growth? When do we transition to increase the ramification and stop that elongation? I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to transition right now. Now, in transitioning, I know that one of these pieces has to elongate dramatically to continue the thickening process, but I've just pushed the energy from that one elongating tip into multiple pieces that can expand that region, and I'm going to take these pieces that were initially laid out very close here, and I'm actually going to take these and I'm going to move them out into space so that I start to create more depth and the presence of that ramification to start to round out that apical region, okay? So when we're looking at this, we do at some point have to make a decision. I'm not done thickening that piece, but I need to transition to some of these finer pieces to build up more branchlets that are representing the apical region, and then I can go back to elongating and developing it. That's just a fundamental part of the apical formation when we look at this stage of development where we have had an expansion of secondary branching and we can start to expand the quality of that region that represents the very top of our design. What a good tree to learn on, huh?
Lots of lessons tonight.
Yeah, going deep on short needle single flush pines.
Yeah, and we've got a ton of videos about short needle single flush pines in the Mirai Live library. There's like lots of focused videos about pruning short needle single flush.
Pinching. I don't think we've ever done this kind of like this like intermediate scope of work on a tree that we've been building. What do we do? I'm not pinching yet. How do I make decisions? How do I start to handle that piece? This is a nuanced, definitely a nuanced stream tonight that fills in a lot of gaps in people's understanding of the short needle single flush genre of pines. I was pretty excited when, this is Sam's idea to do this, and I was pretty excited when she proposed it because I think it does illustrate how much thought has gone into the trees that we are handing over on the web sale. You know, we don't have trees at Mirai that we don't like or that can't be quality bonsai. Like we don't have the time to just sort of play around with stuff that doesn't have potential. So everything that we sell is stuff that I obviously felt could be a world-class tree, or else we wouldn't have taken it on. And they're in so many stages of development that it makes sense to be able to not just sell a finished tree, but to be able to offer people the opportunity to jump in at different scopes of that process and take part in those different scopes, okay? So now, with that move, you start to see that that apex is expanding. This piece here, we're starting to move those back. Jesus, if you can just focus here. You start to see that layout getting a little bit broader. I don't want this moving forward anymore. Now seeing it from the side, you can see why I took off that elongated piece. I will still be allowing growth to occur to thicken this area, but now we're building. And these branchlets are going to play into that apical region. This piece kicking off to the right is going to be an insinuation of direction that when this is all full of branchlets, will have some degree of contribution to the apical region. But this is that next level. After that initial styling, the tree grows out from that structural setting. We get the thickening, we get the back buds. This is something we can do in that late fall period of time, clean it up, set it back outside, no worries about this tree being cold hardy. But we have definitely taken care of all of the things we needed to make sure next spring as it starts growing, it's ready to go, and we're going to continue to advance the quality of our tree.
We don't have any questions in the pipeline.
We're good.
Everybody's
awesome.
Just watching.
Hey, thank you guys so much. Really, again, excited. Obviously, it's like the enthusiasm has spilled over about next week's stream. If you've ever wondered how to create an apex, we probably will answer that question at every stage of development across a multitude of species next week. Don't miss it. It'll be at 7 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time next week. The web sale starts Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Don't miss it. If you want something on the covered wagon, be sure to reach out via email, info@bonsai-mirai.com. And as always, we couldn't do it without you guys. We appreciate the community. We'll continue to keep you growing, but big things on the horizon, and we look forward to seeing you guys all online Thursday morning. Have a great rest of your night. Q&As are at what time?
So first, the stream next week is at 6 p.m., not 7 p.m.
6 p.m.
The Q&As this week are on Thursday. It's at 3 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Forum Q&A is open as well. Other than that, I just wanted to add, if you want to see this every Tuesday night, you can do that by starting a free trial of Mirai Live at live.bonsai-mirai.com.
Join us.
That's it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Have a great night, you guys.